My name is David Bonneau, and I'm a PhD candidate at Queen's University under the supervision of Jean Hutchinson and Scott McDougall at UBC. My work primarily focuses on applications of remote sensing for characterizing debris transfer processes. Good morning. Today I'm going to be talking about some of the work that we've been doing developing slope process models in attempt to characterize the failure processes in post-glacial river terraces in the southern Thompson River Valley. These post-glacial river terraces are a common landform throughout the Thompson. Therefore, it warrants the investigation of these landforms. In addition, this work is in direct support of the ditching and maintenance work that is active throughout the railways in this region. So to start off with, I'm going to provide a little bit of background on some of the conceptual models and where that came from. With any conceptual model, a lot of it goes back to Aldrich Neisser's perceptual cycle, which basically states that we are able to take observations from the real world and try to match predictions guided by our own internal representation. And it is an iterative cycle of making predictions and checking if these predictions match our observations and gradually and continuously updating the model so that our predictions match our observations. So there's been some work in the geosciences on this by Claire Bond. Back in 2007 at a conference, she asked 412 participants to make an interpretation of a section of seismic data, as you can see in the upper left-hand image. And what she found was, depending on your experience, expertise, as well as your education, it had a significant impact on your ability to make interpretations of the data, as well as the conceptual model of the data that arises from your interpretation. And so more formally, a conceptual model is a representation of a system or a process, but it allows us to communicate as well as simulate what basically the model represents. We start off with an idea of a process. We might then run some physical experiments in the laboratory testing to try to figure out mechanistically what is going on, with the eventual goal of trying to capture these processes and be able to express them numerically, because with any numerical model, it allows us to simulate what-if scenarios, and it also serves as a tool for engineering risk decision making. So with all of this in mind, I'd like to introduce our 3 study sites. All of our study sites are just northeast of Lytton, British Columbia, at the confluence of the Thompson and Fraser rivers, with a section of linear infrastructure at the base of each of the 3 slopes. So the first study site is Sandy Cobble Hill. It is located at CN Ashcroft 85.8, as you can see right here. And other site just slightly higher in the stratigraphy with the BC Highway 1 at the base of the slope is the Q2 site. And then a little bit closer to Lytton is the Q1 site, which corresponds to CN Ashcroft 89.65. So for the data sets that are being used in this study, we have over 50 TLS scans captured at Sandy Cobble Hill. This spans between April of 2013 and March of 2020. This covers a 2,517-day study period, which is exceptionally long study period, one of the largest data sets out there to date. At Q1 and Q2, we have 8 and 9 study sites respectively, with the baselines of each were taken in May and April respectively. So with all laser scanning data sets, we also capture high resolution gigapan images taken with a DSLR camera and a 135 millimeter telephoto lens. This is a fly-through of a point cloud or TLS scan captured of Sandy Cobble Hill. You can see the tremendous detail that the point cloud captures of the cliff face. You can see the convex near vertical fins, as well as basically each of the benches in this kind of looking down section actually correspond to cobble, boulder, or gravel horizons in the cliff face. As well as you can see in some locations, there's a bit of occlusion. And this is a result, or basically holes in the data set, which basically correspond to the fact that the terrestrial laser scanner can only see what's in its immediate field of view, not behind it. And so with each data set, we systematically align them with a manual point picking and then iterative closest point matching algorithm, which aligns the two data sets. And then with that, we're able to then do a distance computation between the two data sets. And we can actually start visualizing the change through the color scales that you can see on the screen before you. The warmer colors denote accumulation or deformation, and the cooler colors denote loss. So you can see some accumulation in the ditch adjacent to the highway. We can see some erosion that's actively occurring on the cliff face, as well as in the upper reaches of the slope. This is the convention that I'll be using for the remainder of the talk. In addition to the remote sensing data sets, we've also collected weather data from 4 weather stations that are denoted by the yellow triangle. And so for this talk, I would like to focus on case studies highlighting some of the failure processes that we've been observing at each of the study sites. To start, I would like to talk about the Q1 study slope. With this study slope, on the left-hand side, we can see a typical change detection between May of 2018 and August of 2018. So you can see that there's been some ditching that's occurred, as well as we can actually see some debris that's starting to migrate stepwise down the slope. And then the image on the right is what we're seeing is all of the loss that's occurred on the study slope between each of these dates that are actually broken into temporal. So we're not showing the magnitude, we're simply showing the time period in which these changes occurred. And so what we can see from this is that there's been some ditching work that's occurred at the base of the slope, as well as we can actually see a bit of a channel where debris is actually kind of stepwise migrating down the slope. There's been a lot of change that's occurred in the center portion of that, as well as we see another similar kind of channelized effect to the right of that. What this allows us to really do is to take portions of the slope. We're able to then match the magnitude of change, which you're seeing on the left-hand side, to temporally when it occurs. So we can actually start to understand how these slopes are evolving in some of the failure processes associated with them. With this bubble in particular, there's a little fin up in this portion that you can see, and over the course of the monitoring period, it actually begins to collapse. And the other sequence that I would like to highlight is over here. And so what we see here is a sequence where we actually have incision occurring kind of in the center of these gullied cliff faces, which leads to undercutting the sides, and that actually leads to collapse of the sidewalls, and then the process potentially repeats itself. Especially over the winter months, we typically have the longest time periods in between scans, as well as this is typically when we see the greatest amount of precipitation. And so there's obviously a lot of change that happens between these dates where we see that there's more incision, and then subsequently we're seeing kind of that collapse of the sidewalls after it's been undercut. The next site that I would like to talk about is the Q2. Similarly, we can see accumulation at the base of the slope, some ditching work that the highways have done, as well as a lot of failure that's occurred in the cliff face, as well as in the upper reaches. The first thing I'd like to talk about is this little fin feature right here. So over the course of our monitoring period between March of 2019 and June of 2019, the fin actually collapses. And these are just a couple preceding gigapens leading up to the last time that we were able to document it prior to the failure. And subsequently, after the initial failure had occurred, there's actually been some additional collapse of it. So if we look at the terrestrial laser scanning data of this, what was really interesting is if we look at the change detection before and after the collapse, we really don't see that much failure kind of bounding the surface of the eventual failure perimeter. And in addition, when we do a change detection from the March of 2019 through to June of 2019, there's not that much failure into the slope. It's quite shallow. In this gigapan, we see a fair bit of snow, and we're wondering if some of the fin had frozen material, which didn't lead to the collapse on this side, and that's why failure occurred on the other side. Another sequence of events that occurred at the study site over a monitoring period was a quite significant collapse of a bit of a cliff, where a significant amount of undercutting occurred leading up to the failure. And then basically with the failure change detection, we can actually see that some of the undercutting has actually led to deformation of an upper soil horizon, as well as redistribution of some material on the cliff face as well. This is another really good example. We're seeing what we're calling a typewriter effect, where failure propagates across the cliff face, targeting convex features. And basically, these are potentially more susceptible to failure due to lack of lateral confinement. It's starting to chip away here. We actually had a bit of failure in the cliff face, but basically we're able to start to document these sequences of failure leading up to the eventual collapse. And so this is a section through the slope where we can see there's quite a significant undercut before the cliff actually collapsed. So moving on to Sandy Cobble Hill. So this is basically the results of 50 change detections over the course of the monitoring period. You can see that in both of these cases, there's a lot of failure in the most southern extent of the cliff face, where there's quite a bit higher curvature and convexity in relationship to some of the other portions of the slope. With the Regal data sets, we've had to break it into smaller subsections due to the amount of change that was actually able to be detected on the study slope. Pretty much every year there's a bit of like a resurfacing event. So to kind of parse out the data a little bit more, we're just showing basically in three sections, with the third being here. And so one thing that's interesting to keep in mind is that this is just basically a complete year of change between March of 2019 and March of 2020. So now I'm going to focus in on a couple case studies here. So with the first one being this little fin out here, and just looking at how progressive failure has occurred on the cliff face, leading to it completely collapsing. And so we're doing a dynamic representation of the terrain that all of the change is being projected on. And so you can see that we're almost having a couple meters of retreat at this cliff face. So the next one is a similar portion of the slope, just a little bit higher up. So we're actually getting collapse of this fin feature here, as well as we're actually seeing a lot more of the typewriter effect in this upper horizon here, where it's eroded a couple meters to the right. The last case that I would like to highlight is some failures that are basically occurring in this lower cobble boulder horizon that leads to collapse of the material that's being buttressed above. This is part of the cobble boulder horizon, but that eventually becomes undercut, which causes that cobble boulder to detach from the cliff face. All of the material that was being supported or buttressed by that cobble boulder eventually fails. All the material basically comes down onto the talus slope, which actually starts to bury the cliff face as this starts to retrogress further back into the slope. And so we've seen this a few times at a number of select locations in the study slope, working on the scale of meters in terms of retrogression back into the slope. Stepping through some of the time dates here, we can see that in that case, basically boulder detaches, a lot of the material comes down with it. And so with these data sets, it really allows us to see how they actually evolve over time, which is fantastic. With all of this data, there are some links to the climate. So the upper graphs represents precipitation, and all of the little black dots are the scan dates. Over the winter months, there's the greatest amount of precipitation, but it is incredibly difficult to try to link amount of precipitation with when these failures occurred, especially when we're dealing with scans that are taken at months apart. With the later data sets, we've actually been seeing that there's quite a significant amount of change, especially at Sandy Cobble Hill. If we look at the climate signatures of that, we're seeing quite a bit of precipitation in that late 2013, 2015 periods. It really brings up the question, to what extent are these climate signatures result of conditioning versus triggering, and what are we seeing in the actual change detection results. With all of these different models, we have to understand that everyone sees things differently, and we're dealing with all of these open systems. One thing that I didn't know until I was actually out there is that these happen to be a path for goats, and they are actively kicking down material as they go. And so as complex as we try to make them, we try to strive for realism. And so there's definitely a very difficult trade-off when trying to establish and determine some of these models. So in conclusion, long-term TLS can provide insight into the active processes occurring on these slopes. By having such a long TLS record, it allows us to establish what is a baseline level of activity, because the climate is changing and we need to be able to have some sort of baseline to be able to compare against. I'd like to acknowledge all of the funding agencies and sponsors of this research program, and I'd like to thank you for your attention.